Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is magical words and the power of language. My guest, who will be speaking to us from Gothenburg, Sweden, is James Tunney, an Irish barrister who has lectured throughout the world on international law. He is the author of 2 dystopian novels, Blue Lies, September, and Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is. He is also the author of The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, and his newest book is The Mystery of Trapped Light, Mystical Thoughts in the Dark Age of Scientism. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, James. It's a real pleasure to be with you yet again.
Oh, thank you very much, Jeffrey. I was just thinking, in Glasgow, they say when something is excellent, that's magic.
Well, we're going to be talking about magic today, in particular, magic words. I'm reminded of the Bible. Being Jewish, of course, in the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So the power of words is almost immediately expressed in the Hebrew Bible.
Yes, that's a good point. If we could, continuing from our discussion about magic and mysticism and the relationship between them, I think it's a very close relationship. And if we think of the power of words, we see in the mystical tradition that sound is a creative force that constitutes the universe and life. It's constitutive in a deep sense. So we can see that in the Jewish tradition. We can see that there's consequences of that, for example, in relation to the alphabet and the meaning of words, and the consequences and within that, and the ability to derive meaning from a close examination of what is a divinely inspired alphabet, for example. We can also see it in the Indian tradition, in Hinduism and in Buddhism, particularly in relation to the idea of the word Om and Aum, and the sense that this is a word which represents the meaning of the universe, that it's built into the universe. So when we utter the sound, we are participating in some way in a constitutive cycle, a constitutive force. And we may, for example, think in terms of, in the scientific or physical realm, of cymatics and the idea that sound can cause pattern and it can cause symbols to appear through its very operation. And then we can see it in the Christian terms. If we look in particular at the Gospel of John, we see that it starts off, in the beginning was the Word. If we look at that a bit deeper, we see in Greek terms the idea that ein arche no logos. Logos is word. So the word in a translation doesn't express adequately the full sense of that concept of logos, which has been discussed by philosophers like Heidegger, going back to Philo of Alexandria and Heraclitus. And there's a deeper meaning to logos. Sometimes it's translated as logic or reason and reduced to a form which is taken away from its original source. In its original idea, it represents a similar idea to Om, or in the Jewish tradition, an idea that sound is constitutive and that in some way it's made into flesh. So it's a creative force, and the sound is creative. Now, this is lost sometimes if we just focus on word, or the idea of a word, because if we turn word into a purely pictorial representation of a sound, we miss something, because sound is also affective, that a sound is not independent. If it impacts on us, we receive it into our body and it has emotional impacts. And we can see an idea, for example, of an Irish spiritual thinker who is probably underestimated, a singer called Noreen Rian. She talks about theosophy, the idea of the theology of sound, including silence as a very important aspect. And I know you interviewed Jill Peirce, who Richard Sheldrake has the good fortune to be married to. And again, she's another underestimated thinker in these realms, in the mystical realm. She's written The Mystical Spiral, but she's also worked on sound and the importance of sound. And even in a contemporary context, there's a popular YouTuber from Gothenburg who lives in the north of Sweden called Jonna Jinton. And one of the things she does is it's an old Swedish tradition called kulning, where she goes out and sings, calls to the animals, to wild and domestic animals, and they come. I've tried this myself out in the garden here with the deers. Now, humans don't appreciate my singing. Well, the competition is not too tough with you. I've seen your karaoke, but it's funny, they do respond. They came back in after I gave them a verse of Spansel Hill. But the idea, the sound is important. The pictorial representation of the word is important. And if we swing over into the magical domain, we see that the very construct of magic is dependent on a few fundamental forces. We can think of magic words. We can think of the idea of to cast a spell and spelling. We can think of the word grimoire, which is essentially grammar and grammaire. So the idea of the word is very, very important. And we talked about conjuring in our last interview. And conjuring is based on ideas of utilizing divine words, often taken divine words from the mystical tradition, the word of God in 72, the name of God in 72 letters or various other names, and utilizing them with symbolic representation to achieve results. Now, in the context of the traditions we've mentioned, say, for example, in Hinduism and in Buddhism, we can see the mantra becomes the yantra, a visual representation, which is also often a utilization of triangles and circles to make a map of the world and the spiritual world, or to have contact with particular deities, or to keep out evil spirits. And there's a connection from the mystical traditions. We forget that in the Oriental, the Indian tradition and Tibetan tradition, that they're quite au fait with spirits and demons and how to interact with them in certain elements of it. So it's not as if they're as perhaps precious as some of the contemporary Christians might be in relation to dealing with some of these forces. They have traditions from skilled practitioners in relation to dealing with these forces. But there is a parallel with magic in that sense. We see, when we're talking about conjuring, we see the circles, we see the triangles, we see a similar function. But also, when we're talking about the movement into magic and the use of words and the use of particular words, we see abracadabra, for example. If you look at the Journal of the Plague Years by Daniel Defoe, who wrote about the plague in London in 1665, he talked about people trying to use abracadabra to protect them from the plague. It didn't work. I wouldn't advise it. It didn't work in the context. But we had that tradition of magical words and words of power and the power of naming. And I would like to put into the equation, when we're talking about some of these issues, the commercial context. And in particular, I would draw attention to the power of trademarks. A trademark, I used to teach intellectual property, so I realize it takes a while for people to understand some of the basic concepts. But a trademark is an asset which is valuable on its own, independent of the company, independent of all the other assets. And it might be their most valuable asset. But really, it's a symbol. It's a symbol which is useful because it's associated with goodwill. And goodwill is the force, the attractive force which brings in custom. And if we think of all the very, very powerful trademarks, Gothenburg is associated with Volvo, for example, or Coca-Cola, or trademarks associated with particular products. Word, for example, Word in relation to technology. We see that they're described as commercial logos. So we see a direct appropriation, a direct substitution, a taking in a way of the traditional concept of logos into a commercial context. Now, I'm not a Marxist, but sometimes some of the Marxist critiques of the commercial system, like if we think of the society or the spectacle of the society of the spectacle, for example, we can see critiques which are actually accurate in their identification of problems associated with the market. And the idea of logos there and words and the power of words and how they can be utilized to hypnotize us, to bring us into a different construct of reality. That's where the real matrix lies. And that's where some people talk in terms of the black magic of the market in that sense, and how we are subject to that magic. And that magic is the determinative force in the construct of the contemporary world.
It seems to me now we're combining symbolic representation, whether it's visual or spoken. In either case, it seems to me that symbols are used to focus mental intention.
If we think in terms, as we've talked before, of the mystic who goes into a darkened space, it's quite clear that we go into a darkened space, we begin to see things. And what recurs in those contexts, or in the hypnagogic context, there is a certain recurrence of symbols. They come up again and again. If we look back on prehistoric art in Europe, there was a range of apparently abstract symbols. And they come up again and again, right? And there's 32 or 33 common symbols that are used again and again. And a lot of them are ones which come from the physiologically, from within the person. So there is some sense that these are built into the universe. And even as we see scientists looking at trapping light, for example, and trapping photons, we see that some of the symbols like the Maltese cross, they come back again and again. It's the idea that they're built into the universe. So similarly, with relation to sound, as those things are built into the fabric of the universe, the idea of the of the oral images, the auditory ideas are also there. So Ra, Ma, El, these sounds are recurrent through various religions and spiritual contexts. So we have to begin to. Some people would argue that indicates that there was some basic perennial theology that lay behind it. Alternatively, these are actually built into the fabric of the universe and we access them. So when we're utilizing and returning to sounds, we recover them. And also we have to consider Rupert Sheldrake and his idea of morphic resonance, the idea that these are built in through participation. And that idea of resonance is critical. And it also comes up in relation to Tesla and his ideas of energy and frequency and vibration, which is consistent with the Upanishads, is consistent with Taoism, it's consistent with a vibratory universe. And in Taoism as well, we have the same thing from the symbols and the yin-yang symbol, the yin-yang concepts. And also remember that in Taoism, they're familiar as well with circles, with dealing with demons, all that, as well as the looking at the world, drawing on the idea of water and flow and movement and dynamic balance. So we do see a fairly universal approach. But one important question is, to what extent have we lost some of those elements that integrate the concept of those things?
Yeah, the irony to me is that everybody, all of our viewers are using words all of the time throughout the day. It's hard to even have a thought that doesn't involve a word. And yet we say that some words are special or some uses of words become sacred or magical. Somehow there's a line somewhere between the secular use of language and words and words that become more powerful. And it's hard to know exactly where that line is.
We're going through a period of word inflation. There's so many words around us that they can become meaningless. So that's an important point. The same way as the logos became the commercial logos, society is very good at taking the meaningless and making it meaningful, and the meaningful and making it meaningless. So that's a very true. But another example of symbols, words in an integrated sense, if we go back to the ancient Irish alphabet, the Irish language, which contains the oldest vernacular, non-Latin literature in Western Europe, it stemmed from a pre-existing, or was related to a pre-existing alphabet called, the English call it Ogham, O-G-H-A-M, but the correct pronunciation is Ogham. So the language that existed of the Druids was Ogham, which was characterized by strokes, usually on a rock or a stone. Now the implications, and it was studied by some of the ecclesiasticals that came afterwards, and the idea of this language was that it was related to trees, it was related to seasons, it was related to colours, that it was an integrated idea of the universe, and that could be utilized probably in relation to invoking energies or interacting energies, or maintaining a holistic sense of symbolism, consistent perhaps with the idea of the song lines with the Aboriginal people in Australia. And again, when we're talking about sounds and words, we have to consider the impact on the ear and the ear of the heart, as the Sufis talk about, and that the word in Latin cantare is very, very important. We have that coming into chants, incantations, enchant and disenchant. So there is a sense that the access to this sound associated with music or words is a critical aspect of our reality. And that and perhaps if we look at the Irish context, we can only speculate about the full import and use of these ideas, but that when they came to words, it was part of an integrated apparatus of meaning. And if we look at the Bibles, for example, in the early Christian period in Ireland and Scotland and England, the illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells, for example, we see that the words were integrated with figures and with animals and with nature into a wider fabric. And of course, with the printing press, with the Reformation, the word became separated. So when you say in the beginning was the word that we have in the 1500s was very, very different from the conception of the word even a few hundred years beforehand in the tradition in which it came from.
You earlier spoke about the distinction between magic and mysticism, and it strikes me that in mystical traditions, words are often used, for example, chanting. It's a form of dissolution of the ego when you keep chanting Om or other chants, whereas in the magical tradition, words of power seem to be almost the opposite. It is the ego endeavoring to enact some sort of willful intention.
That's a very good observation. I think that's true, and it defines the difference of emphasis in the mystical path and the magical path. Again, as I would emphasize, there is an element of control in the magical path, which believes that through the use of often mystically derived powers or observations, that there can be control of one's life and of more complex forces outside of one's domain. Whereas in the mystical tradition, the idea of identification with sounds is, as you said, as part of the process of dissolution of ego, but also the process of identification with the universe and with other beings by finding points of harmony by which one can understand other consciousness. And that comes from a different place than where the magician comes from. Although, again, there's a crossover, as Dean Radin has talked about and written about in Real Magic. In some sense, magical powers or powers associated with parapsychology are also the same powers that occur in the context of the mystical exploration, the siddhis. So there is a crossover. And there is also a crossover whereby magicians start off as magicians and then they become mystics. We might think of Evelyn Underhill. I think the same applies to Emanuel Swedenborg as well, that he explored what were magical traditions and then God began to speak to him and he moved over more into a mystical tradition. So I don't want to make too big of a distinction in a way that seems that I'm putting magic down in that sense, but its starting points are different. And if it remains about the ego, it certainly goes off in a different path, although there are crossroads within it. But your argument or suggestion is a very good description of the different emphasis in the traditions.
Also, when you consider secular life, it seems to me that almost in every profession, and certainly in the legal profession, one's ability to exercise appropriate use of words is often the difference between success and failure in almost any endeavor.
Yes, and again, we have another distinction there, because if you look at ideas associated with hypnosis, for example, Milton Erickson, or if you look at ideas of neuro-linguistic programming, or if you look at sometimes seen as a controversial idea about neuro-linguistic programming as developed by Bandler and Grinder and those guys, we see a different emphasis in relation to the use of words. Of course, for a hypnotist or a therapist using it in therapeutical purposes, it's good. We assume it's a good purpose. But also language can be manipulated to achieve objectives. So again, if we are utilizing language to achieve power, to manipulate people, to cause fear, to increase their fears, to make them engage in political activity. For example, in the context of the Rwandan genocide, words were very important, and there's been, if you like, proved or argued successfully that radio is a more powerful force to incite people to mass violence than other forces. It's quite surprising. So words can be used for nefarious purposes, and that's the problem with moving away from deeper ideas of an integrated sense of meaning and words. So in the sense for some people of, if we take the Christian idea, the idea of the Logos manifest and adherence and identification with the Logos, the idea is that we're identifying with what is true and what is truthful. So it's not about being persuasive. If you listen to legal cases, sometimes you hear the case for the plaintiff and you say, oh yeah, that's very convincing. And then you hear the case for the defendant and you say, oh, that's equally convincing, and it becomes difficult to interpret reality. But the idea that there is some inherent truth, or that we should speak truthfully, or as the Buddha talks about, right words, or as people like Gerald Heard emphasize, what if we lived in a world where people were just honest? If people lived in a world where they endeavored to be honest, well, it would cut out a lot of problems, even if that truth was something we didn't want to hear. But another point in relation to this and some of the developments in relation to people's powers is that a lot of people say, well, you can develop mystically without any dogma. And dogma means there's no principles that you have to engage in. There are simple principles, as Houston Smith, who you knew, as he identified in all the different religions, there's some simple principles. Don't kill, don't cause harm to other beings, be honest. I mean, it's not much more dogma than that, really, is the central core of the perennial wisdom. So if those inform and relate, well, then we can keep it on a smooth path.
When you talk about truth, it's a very important function that words have of expressing the truth. And yet advertisers and politicians and other people have known for a long time, if you repeat words often enough, they stick in people's minds, whether they're true or false. I, for example, can repeat advertising jingles that I heard in my childhood for products that haven't been on the market for decades.
Yes, and it's true, and the mind can easily be tricked. And there's two things that come to mind in that context. When I went to the Native Americans first in Canada, and we sat around, we were having discussions about various things, and then the person in charge passed around the stone. So the person with the stone in their hand is the only person that can talk. And he said, when the stone went around, "Now don't speak from your head, speak from your heart." And it kind of struck me very, very quickly that two different places with two different results. So we have lost the capacity to speak from the heart. And that's a different place. It's a different meaning. And it's because talk is cheap in that sense. And because of the misuse of the magical society and the propaganda society, as Chomsky talks about. And the other person that's relevant is Ian McGilchrist, and who follows on the ideas of the bicameral mind and the idea of left brain, right brain. Now, whatever one agrees with the full import of what he says, there is certainly a difference between a left brain society and a right brain society, in the sense that the left brain society focuses on particularities, on microscopic things, on detail, and it cannot see the big picture. It cannot see the interrelationship between things. It cannot see the full context. And to a certain extent, a lot of these problems come from an over-reliance on that kind of left brain idea. And if we look at Bill Gates said that the future belonged to the symbolic logicians. The symbolic logicians for me are the magicians. And Arthur C. Clarke said that any sufficiently developed science is indistinguishable from magic. So the people that are developing high technology are the magicians of the future. But if they're not what would have been called divine magicians, whether it be in the Hermetic tradition or in the Christian Renaissance magic tradition, then we're in trouble. Because when they have control, it will be difficult to undo that control.
Well, you've really brought up an interesting point here. The future may belong to computer programmers who work with code. There seems to be almost no heart whatsoever in computer language, and yet those words, that symbolic language is extremely important. More and more, you see people whose lives are being run by the apps they have on their iPhones. I know in your case, you don't even have an iPhone.
I don't think I'd recognize an iPhone in a lineup if I seen it, but yes, and this is a big problem, because what it means is that increasingly there's going to be a bias towards the type of mind which is literal, the type of mind which is very strong in those symbolic mathematical domains. And those domains are fantastic, but they may be severely limited in other contexts. And increased emphasis on those things and the increasing involvement and control, and our world will be run and is being run to a certain extent by commercial forces which are peopled with these people. And I'm not criticizing them, but there's a danger. They have assumed too much power. And there have been, for example, existing forces which haven't been brought in. For example, antitrust in the United States, the Sherman Act and various pieces of legislation which are there to minimize the effect of corporate power in the market can be considered. But there is a really deep problem of disintegration associated with that left brain, as Ian McGilchrist has made out. And it takes away from the integrative force. And it strikes me that if you look at the work of Jill Peirce or Noreen Nirian, for example, or any of or Jonna Jinton, there is something integrative about their use and understanding and comprehension of sound. It involves a full picture of the world, an integrating picture, linking us with the earth, with animals. And another important resonance that we forget about is the earth in this context, as particularly aware in the Native American traditions and native traditions around the world. About 4 years ago, we went around Australia and New Zealand for about 3 months, and we slept in a tent, so it was on the ground every night. And that really has an impact on your being, because you're identifying with the resonance of the earth. And that's a real force, as we know through ideas about grounding and connection. We're becoming very removed. And now we have to sit at home and communicate, get used to communicate in different forms, which is fantastic in one sense. The dark side is we're getting distance from people, and people need contact with other people. We are social animals. We need physical contact, and the process of focusing on particular left brain, wordy, symbolic logician, mathematical concepts will distance us from reality and create a very restricted sense of reality, and also make sure that the next phase of human development will be transhumanism instead of an infusion of mankind and machine, instead of the development of spiritual powers. And that's a great dynamic conflict that we need balance in.
In my religious upbringing in the Jewish tradition, I remember many times going into the synagogue, and there would be a service, and people would go through the prayers and the songs in kind of a mechanical way, because you do it every week over and over and over again. It became almost, you'd see people repeating the words as fast as they could just to get through the prayer. And it strikes me that in the mystical tradition of Judaism, there was this word, I think it's kavanah. It means the spirit or the feeling with which you express the words. That seems to make all the difference. I'm thinking of the founder of the Hasidic movement was called the BAAL which meant master of the good name or master of the holy name. It's not enough just to say the words. It has a lot to do with the feeling and the intention that is put into the word as it is pronounced. They would say, the master of the holy name, his words would reach up to heaven because of the intention.
Yeah, that's a very interesting example. Thanks for sharing with us. But what I think of when you said that was a friend of mine who used to be a Catholic priest, and he was perhaps unorthodox in some senses in his approaches. And I saw him perform a mass in a hotel after I arranged a football match in Dublin, and he set up the altar himself, and it was very, very basic, and it was more powerful than most masses I had been to, because there was nothing extra. It was just the simple idea of what was behind it, and it was more powerful because of the spirit, despite its unorthodox quality. And one of the reasons why people in Ireland remained attached to the Catholic Church was because there was many priests during a time when they were greatly persecuted, of course. There's graveyards. There's a graveyard in Ireland I was in, and it has a gravestone, and the title of the occupation of the person buried there was priest hunter. So it was difficult. But in that context, the priests identified with the people. So they used to have masses on stones, for example. There's mass stones around the country, out in the forest, like the Druids did. Very, very simple. Watching for that they would be found, identifying with the people, in nature, very, very simple. Now, for that reason, people had perhaps an attachment to individuals, really, rather, perhaps sometimes more than the institution. But it was very, very powerful because it was simple and it was genuine. And I think in future that some of the religious traditions will find a return to that simplicity. And in the context of magic, I see that you talked about your friend Isaac Bonewits, who was into magic and wrote very well about some of the basic concepts. And also, I think he was associated with an organisation, or Nríocht Féin, which is Irish words, our own magic, which referred back to the Druidic idea, the Celtic idea associated with nature. And although with all the Druidic traditions, they're reconstructions to a certain extent, there are some genuine ideas there in such approaches. I don't know enough about those organisations, but in relation to the idea of identification with nature and bringing nature back into it. But it all goes back to the spirit, because if you're word focused, there may be no spirit there. And also doing something from the heart. The spirit and the heart are inextricably connected. So if we are doing things by rote and talking and without involvement, well then it must become meaningless.
I'm also reminded of some of Carl Jung's earliest work in psychiatry. He developed what he called the word association test. He would simply give his patients a word and ask them, what do you associate with that word? Like table, chair. And he would time how long it took for the person to come up with an association. And he determined that the longer it took for somebody to come up with a word association, that meant that they were blocking, that they had some sort of negative association they didn't want to say, so they'd have to go to the next one. And that way he could tell which words seemed to be emotionally charged for his patients, and that helped guide the psychotherapy. And recently, for example, I've had viewers talk about a word, Lucifer or Luciferian. And I know some of our viewers feel that this is a horrible word, that Lucifer is very dark, negative energy to be avoided. And other viewers think, no, this is good. Lucifer is a god of light and passion and brilliance and beauty. And so it's very interesting how words have, at the unconscious level, different triggers for different people.
Yes, and I think we'll talk again, perhaps in the future, about some of the deeper ideas about Luciferianism and some of the concepts. But there's no question about that. And we have to consider that if you look at hypnosis or psychotherapy, as far as I know, I don't know anything about psychotherapy, but what I've read about it, and neuro-linguistic programming, we're dealing with the idea that everyone has a model of reality in their mind. And that model may be largely constructed of words, of a mosaic of words, ideas, thoughts, books, films, images, put together, emotions. And in order to change their reality, we have to engage with their model. And in order to engage with their model of reality, we have to find out what it is. So, and then when we do, we have to look at, say, for example, with the word Lucifer. In the esoteric tradition, there's certainly two strands. There are strands, go back to Marlowe, in the traditional view that Lucifer is bad, associated with the devil. And there's also an esoteric idea with Blavatsky and Steiner about Luciferian being a different being, carrying a light. And if I'm not mistaken, there might have been even an early pope who had Lucifer in his name. I'll check on that. But Lucifer wasn't necessarily associated with some of these things. But we will investigate in that in a deeper sense. But it behoves us, when we're talking about words, to look at the etymology of words, the meaning of words, the usage, the history. If you're a pragmatist in the William James tradition, say, well, you're not starting off with a fundamental ideology which says something where you take the answer from. You have to follow, you have to investigate. You don't get a pre-existing, ready-made answer given to you from whatever ideology, whether it be extreme left or extreme right or religious fanaticism. You don't predetermine your answer. You have to investigate and look at the history, look at the range of sources, the philology, etc. So.
Well, we started by talking about magic words, and you brought up the example of people using the word abracadabra to ward off the plague, the bubonic plague in that era. You point out it didn't work. There were many corpses that had abracadabra written all over their body. It didn't save them. What is your attitude towards magical words? Do you think that they can be efficacious?
Yes, I do think. And I do think that, in particular, if we look at the use in art and in literature, and particularly in Shakespeare, for example, that we see that the use of words with other forces of rhythm and context can be very, very important in relation to changing people's perspective. And we may find answers in the use of words. And poetry, for example, may be useful to open up realms of consciousness, perhaps to move into the indeterminate element of the right side of the brain, to make people look back at the side of the brain that wants things very finite. And a lot of mystical experiences, neuroscientists say they're visitor experiences representing part of the brain talking to the other part of the brain. There might be some truth in that. I don't believe that to be a final or determinative description of mystical experience, but there's some element of that may be true sometimes. So that words, if we think of the example of Shakespeare, for example, it gives us access to insight from different times and place, and sometimes superior insight.
I'm also reminded of the Islamic Quran, and my understanding is that it was originally spoken before it was ever written down, and that these words were very powerful for the people who heard them. They had resonance and meaning, and it was based on the power of the language itself that enabled the Islamic religion to spread all the way from Spain to Indonesia within a relatively short period of time. I think, a century or so, to become a global religion.
Again, we have the singing and chanting in the Islamic tradition, which is, and the call to prayer, which is very, very important. And even before that, if we look in Egypt in the Hermetic tradition, there's indications that sound was very, very important aspect of the goddess figure in relation to constitution and integration in the various stories and various myths. And in the Sufi tradition from there and going back and related in some ways to some of the Egyptian tradition, we see the idea of the language of the birds or the green language or older ideas of a spiritual language, again suggesting resonance and connection with the universe. And I suppose if we look through the Moorish Spain, the Islam ruled Spain for 800 years, and we can see in the great cities of Cordoba and Seville and Toledo, we can see where the Judaism and Islam and Christianity came together, and they were crucibles of magic as well. But we see the different approaches to aesthetics, not representing the human figure. And if you start off with certain limitations, you can achieve results that you wouldn't do without that limitation. Limitations are very, very useful in an artistic sense and in a creative sense. So, but sound is critically important in all those traditions. But sound is seen sometimes as a disembodied force removed from the context it operates in. And my point would be that sound is affective and works on people's heart and can penetrate in a way that other things can't if it comes from the heart. And it's powerful in that sense.
Earlier, you brought up Shakespeare, and as I recall, Shakespeare in Macbeth and in The Tempest employs the use of magical words, but the magical words or the prophetic words can sometimes be misleading.
In Macbeth, the most important aspect of that play for me is when Macbeth is coming home from the battlefield, right at the start, with Banquo, and Banquo is going to come to an end as a result of what Macbeth does. But they meet the witches, and the witches tell Macbeth that he is going to be promoted, and they tell Macbeth that he is going to be the King of Scotland, and Banquo's sons will inherit the throne in Scotland. And it turns out to be true that he gets promoted to be another lord of the area, and he begins to think of the implications of this. And he asks Banquo, well, what do you think about this? And Banquo says that these ministers of darkness tell us truths in little things, only to betray us in deeds of the greatest consequence. So there's a very important message, and it turns out after Macbeth engages on his crimson path of destruction towards his own personal hell, that while the witches who were conjuring spirits told them things that were true, and that impacted on his behavior and encouraging his wife, encouraging him to kill Duncan the Meek, that it leads to his destruction. And in the end, he's saying, they told me things that were true in a literal sense, but they didn't tell me the whole story. So there is a kind of moral message about, it doesn't deny that these spirits exist, but it says these will lead you to destruction. And it's again about the implications of intervening to solve things. There's a gangster kind of crime element to the Macbeth play. And in the Tempest, of course, now the first one, Macbeth, was written in 1606. It was in the context of King James and that spirit around the place, who had written about demonology, who was hostile to witches, who believed that they were real forces and believed he'd been affected by them. So, of course, Shakespeare was part of the system. He was there to please the king or queen or whoever. So he wasn't a radical on the fringes somewhere. And then, but by the time we move to 1611, The Tempest, which may be his last play and is seen to be a swan song for Shakespeare, and Prospero, in some senses, for some people, is seen to represent Shakespeare himself. We see a great discussion or a great play about magic and what magic is. And we see Prospero exiled to an island because he's been reading his books too much and not concentrating on the affairs of state as a Duke of Milan. His brother Antonio takes power, seizes power, and he's sent off. A friend of his gives him some books, or some of his books, and helps him survive or start off better. They arrive in the island. He gains power over the spirits. Some of the spirits, like Ariel, have been trapped in a tree. He unleashes them. And Caliban, the monster, he has control over. And, of course, we have the famous incident with a storm that he sets like the PK man. He uses Ariel to help with this storm. And then he rewrites the world. And in the end, he says, when he has rewrited what was wrong and been vindicated to some extent, he says, rough magic, I abjure thee. And he buries his magic wand and decommissions it, which is very, very interesting. And also we have a statement, one of the most famous statements, and again, talking about the magic of words, where he says, our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of the vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. Now, for me, that represents a statement by him of the spiritual nature of the universe in as fine way as could be put, identifying how spirit is triumphant over the illusions of the material world and will persist in the end. And on that route, he identifies that magic is real, he demonstrates it, he applies it to right an injustice that has happened. But then in the end, he seems to suggest that the innocent daughter Miranda, with her innocent view of the world, with her idea of a brave new world that has such figures in it, such people in it, such as arrived up on her island, even though they may not have been magnificent people, with her innocence and her compassion as manifest at certain cases, and perhaps in a way with the example, strangely, of the spirit Ariel, who seems to have a beneficent idea of the world to some extent. We see that Prospero doesn't believe that magic can solve everything, and therefore he relinquishes his rough magic and realizes that his power is but faint. Now you might say he's achieved all his objectives, but there's an interesting question there. And that play, of course, was adopted by people like Aimé Césaire, the French Caribbean thinker, left-wing thinker, who was associated with Frantz Fanon, who wrote The Wretched of the Earth. And they saw in a very colonial context where Prospero was lying and he was imprisoning the natives in Caliban. An interesting and very moving depiction. But I believe there is a message there about the nature of magic and about the nature of control and about the limitations of control.
Wonderful words of wisdom, James. Let me just bring up, as a psychologist, it seems to me that the most important use of magical words are the words that we tell ourselves. What psychologists call it self-talk. And I've done monologues about it, but it seems to me that people become confident and powerful when they speak to themselves in a positive manner. And when I hear myself sometimes say something negative, I have the power to say, cancel that thought.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I detest when I hear people talking negatively to themselves and I see them constructing a negative spiral, and I'm very, very careful when I hear my friends or people around me talking in a negative way about themselves, that they be careful. Not when you can be we have to be self-critical, but when we begin to put weight and create a downward spiral, we can go to dark places. So I think it's very, very important to be self-critical, but also to be positive about the fundamental elements. And the fundamental elements, if you come from a mystical perspective, is that you have divine spirit in you. You are formed of the divine nature. That imprinted in you is the structure of the universe. You have that beauty inside you. You have that power inside you. You have that consciousness inside you. You have it. You are it. So you have to remind yourself of that constantly. The other things are minor things. The other things are things that will pass. They're of the world that will disappear. But the idea in the mystical tradition is that your spirit does not disappear in the same way. In whatever way, it will persist or reflect or continue until perhaps even in some billions of years in the future it's reintegrated. But the suggestion is in many mystical traditions that the soul, the spirit, persists. And in a karmic sense, we have to look in the long term and not in the short term. The problem with Macbeth was that he wanted to solve things in the material world now. And by doing so, he lost his soul. It's the same story as Dr. Faustus. It's the idea that you don't actually believe that you are a spiritual person, that you are a spiritual being, that you are part of the great consciousness of the universe, and that you will allow parts of your brain or the left-hand brain or whatever it is, or or other people to put you down and to stop you from recognizing your own consciousness and the divinity of that. And when you do so, you're also not going to allow other people be treated by you in the same way, because by definition, recognizing that process in yourself requires you to see that reflection in other people. And as you constantly emphasize, you want to be the best version of yourself. And when you're the best version of yourself, the universe will respond, but also you can show the way for other people. I think this idea is very, very important in relation to our mystical evolution. All around the world, there are individuals who are developing on their own, and through their investigation of their personality, their dark side, their bright side, and finding their own path in the way that Campbell talked about in the hero's journey, but in a spiritual context, evolving in whatever tradition they are or in no tradition. Evolving, they begin, as Eckhart talked about in The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary, they begin to recognize that they are part of an invisible network that develops, and through that resonance, they can begin to create a different viewpoint, a viewpoint which will counteract the negative tendencies. So, in a long-winded way, the answer is yes. We have to talk to ourselves very well, and it's not good to put yourself down, because there's loads of people out there that will put you down. So the least you can do is give yourself a chance, and don't put yourself down, and don't talk negatively, and believe in yourself and believe in that divine, because you're a carrier of a greater force.
James Tunney, wonderful words of wisdom. What a delight to be with you. I'm really thrilled to let our viewers know that we plan even more discussions about the different paths of magic and mysticism. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I enjoyed our conversation as always. It's always very interesting, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
And for those of you viewing, thank you for being with us.